Welcome to Command and Control, a podcast series about military command and the control measures used to orchestrate combat engagements and wars. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
At Systematic, we make the coordination of fires simple by unifying your operational and fires missions plans into one C4 ISR management platform. The Sit-Aware Fire Support module increases your responsiveness by reducing the time between target identification and fires response, while ensuring full collaboration between all elements involved in the operation.
As we're recording this at the start of April 2025, we are nearly a month into the idea of a peacekeeping, peace enforcement, reassurance, whatever force in Ukraine should a ceasefire ever come about. There have been some detailed discussions in London, Paris and elsewhere about what that force might look like, who would contribute what bits and what the mandate might be. None of these are finalised or even certain. But it's worth going into one issue around this that has largely gone out of fashion in an era in which Western militaries are obsessed with high-intensity state-on-state conventional war, the command and control of peacekeeping operations. Here we're not simply talking about the commander, whoever is selected to run the operation in his headquarters, but about why command and control in these missions is different and what makes it different. Now, there's a long and august history of peacekeeping missions. States have been contributing them for interregnums between the major combat operations for more than 4,000 years. And it's not like they've only been done under Western colonial rules. In the East, peacekeeping missions have been a recurring theme since recorded history began. And given these histories, there are lots of observations, lessons, best practice procedures, TTPs and tactics associated with them. Many deal with the actual context and culture of the forces deployed, but also the specific geographic locations they work in. It's unfortunate then that Western militaries spend less time looking at these instead of reinventing the wheel. A further complication is that the Western corporate knowledge of peacekeeping operations is more slender than has been the case in recent history. We might get into that in a bit more detail during this episode, but finding the right person to talk about this topic is difficult. I needed someone with both operational and academic expertise to deal with both sides and to give us some useful headmarks. Ewan Lawson is an Associate Fellow at RUSI, a veteran of the UK Armed Forces, and has a bunch of useful experience under his belt. He also championed the peacekeeping community when he's based in London at RUSI. Ewan, listen, welcome to the show. Can you start us off by talking about what makes C2 different for peacekeeping, peace enforcement, reassurance, as opposed to the rather hierarchical and formulaic C2 processes that we've focused on in this show over the past 18 months?
Thanks, Peter. I think the key word I would use would be fragmentation, and I'll come back to that as we work through the conversation. But if I start thinking really first about UN peacekeeping, I think at some point, if you're going to talk about Ukraine, you're probably going to also have to reflect on HQ ISAF as probably an equally pertinent model. But again, if we start with UN peacekeeping, the first problem, and you've used the word already, is mandates. UN Security Council resolutions and the mandates that fall from those, by their very nature, tend to be pretty broad, pretty vague, pretty much designed to ensure that you can get the Security Council to sign up for it. And even at the points in history where the P5 have all been on broadly the same side, there have still been important differences in the perception of the extent to which intervention, which is what a peacekeeping operation is, but intervention is acceptable in a sovereign state. So this is where the problem starts. The problem starts with the mandate, and it starts with who is the higher headquarters. So in UN peacekeeping, clearly that's the United Nations in New York. But what does that mean in practice? Well, the constructs in New York have changed a number of times in recent years, but in essence, there's a Department of Peace Operations now. It used to be the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and a department also associated with logistics. And these are staffed by personnel from different member states of the United Nations, some on secondment, some on direct employment by the UN. And their primary function is to make sure that there are some basic minimum standards and to also ensure that the operations are run broadly in terms of the mandate. Now, that all might sound very obvious, but that is not the same as a military strategic headquarters or a political military strategic headquarters like, say, the Ministry of Defence in London or the Pentagon or the equivalents in other capitals. It's a much more woolly organisation, if I can put it that way. That's not the intent of the individuals, and it's very much not a slight on those individuals. But the very nature of the business means that the clear direction that you might get, even in something like a NATO operation, where the structures are very clear, in a lot of peacekeeping operations, those are less clear, but to say particularly those where the mandating organisation is United Nations or perhaps the African Union, or indeed one of the smaller organisations below the African Union, ECOWAS, for example. So I think this is the first problem.
So how does that reflect against, and you referenced it, the experiences that Western forces will have had at HQ ISAF? The mandate, again, was vague. There was a lot of interpretation that was open to the commander. But, I mean, they will have experienced and maybe be drawing on quite a lot of their experience for people who served in Afghanistan over that period, maybe even going back to those that served in Iraq, and drawing some of that out. Is that going to be a useful framework to look back on, or would it feel something very different?
I think it's a very useful framework to look back on, in as much as looking at what doesn't work as what does work. Where were the problems? And things like lead nation responsibilities for particular aspects of the mandate. The UK, I think, had at one point the lead nation responsibility for counter narcotics, and the problems that then causes in terms of when you're then also conducting a counterinsurgency operation in the field. So understanding where some of these things went wrong, I think it's not unfair to say in HQ ISAF. I think that's going to be a really important thing. I think reflecting on the HQ ISAF experience, and indeed, as you say, the Iraq experience as well. Albeit Iraq was largely US-led. Whilst it might have masqueraded as a multinational headquarters, multinational force Iraq, it was effectively a US headquarters with some embeds, I would contend. ISAF was more of an effort to make it more of a NATO headquarters. Indeed, it was a NATO headquarters at various points, which is a slightly different construct. And I think if we're looking at a Ukraine situation, it's going to be a European Union or some form of NATO headquarters. I mean, the rumours are that HQ is, starting to think about what its role could be. And in that sense, that's different to the UN model, because when we're starting now to talk about the operational headquarters, so we've talked briefly about strategic direction challenges. When you start to talk about the operational headquarters, the first challenge is inherently multinational. Now, inherently multinational doesn't need to be a massive challenge, because if you take a NATO model, those nations are used to working with each other. They're used to working in operational contexts. The little areas where people rub against each other are very visible, and lessons have been learned over time. The UN experience is fundamentally different, because each of the force headquarters in each of the missions, so here again, and I could see potentially a similar situation occurring in Ukraine. You have a political headquarters, effectively. So in a UN mission, UN peace operation, you would have a mission headquarters, effectively, with the special representative of the Secretary General, the SRSG, as a political lead, because fundamentally peacekeeping is a political project, and the force is in support of the political project. So you have that headquarters, and then you'd have the force headquarters. Now, the force headquarters is generally an ad hoc construct. It's thrown together on the day. A force commander is nominated. There's all sorts of political reasons why individuals and might reflect the makeup of the troop contributing countries, but frequently it involves nations who have not worked together. So when my time in South Sudan, for example, the main troop contributors were Rwanda, Mongolia, India, and I think Bangladesh. Then you had a Role 2 hospital provided by Cambodia, the helicopters provided by Ukraine, and all of that reporting into an operational military headquarters, the force headquarters, staffed by a combination of effectively nominees from some of these countries, normally including the force commander and the deputy force commander, frequently a chief of staff from one of the main financially contributing nations, so British and Norwegian rotation in South Sudan, and then staff officers agreed effectively in a kind of bun fight in New York. We'll draw out a structure of the headquarters, and the Brits might say, well, we'd quite like to have, the J5 plans lead and the J3 ops lead, please, because we're the British and we're very important and we know what we're doing. And then the Indians, for example, would say, well, hang on, but we're the people doing the operations. So wouldn't it be better if J3 ops was in India? So there's those debates go on. And inevitably, I think, unless the Ukraine operation is run from an established headquarters, of which the ARC is the obvious model, albeit a NATO headquarters deploying into Ukraine may be problematic in terms of any peace agreement, I would suggest. Unless it is one of those, you are going to have these similar issues where the key troop contributing countries, and not just the key ones in terms of scale, but it might be that there's a country that puts a brigade in, but that brigade is just a brigade from part of its large armed forces. There might be another country that puts a battalion in, but that country literally only has a brigade level of troops. So it's a third of its armed forces are deployed. I'm deliberately being slightly extreme in describing this, but everyone has a legitimate reason to say, well, actually, no, we need this voice in the headquarters for the following reasons. And then layered on top of this, you have this relationship between this effectively operational political headquarters and this operational military headquarters. Now, I like to think that's not how ISAF particularly worked, in the sense that each of the embassies of the troop contributors involved in ISAF had their way of engaging with HQ ISAF. But, if you do have perhaps a special representative to Ukraine, they will have their own headquarters. And the ability of those two organizations to talk completely past each other should never be underestimated. The ability of the political not to listen to the military and the military to assume the political don't know what they're doing can lead to real problems. And certainly my time in South Sudan around 2012, there was a real tension between the military headquarters, the force headquarters, and the mission headquarters, the SRSG's team, about how the force should be deployed, what the role of the force was, how the force was there to support the mission's wider objectives. Because, of course, and this may or may not be the case in Ukraine, there are a load of other people on the ground as part of this mission who are not military. There are people doing work on livelihoods, and there'll be people doing work on reconstruction. There'll be people doing work on the wide-scale mental health issues. And these may well be part of that broader mission, or may not, as the case may be. I mean, we're speculating wildly about what a reassurance force might look like. But you potentially have this tension, and certainly the UN experience that I have seen, that tension can be quite a significant one. And unfortunately, it bizarrely comes back again. It's about the personalities. If you get the right personalities at the political lead and the military lead who are grown-ups and can talk to each other, then it works well. If one of those doesn't work and the relationship breaks down, then there can be real problems.
So it feels like there's a huge amount to unpack from that, and I want to get into some of it. But it feels like this sort of relationship between the SRSG and the military commander over what's going to be, let's call it an ambiguous mandate, right, it is going to be absolutely critical. Bearing in mind that the SRSG doesn't get a say in who the commander is, that relationship feels quite important. But again, it's more than that. It's about the headquarters linking in together and trying to come up with a coherent and cohesive set of objectives and aims. But it goes back to this word you introduced at the start, which is fragmentation. I mean, in many ways you'd say, well, it just requires more collaboration and more integration and more discussion, all those popular things, IT can achieve it and all the rest of that stuff that people will talk about. But it feels quite a personal set of relationships that's got to be established in each of the teams. What sort of size is an SRSG's sort of headquarters compared to a sort of military force op one?
So generally, they vary massively in size. Depends on the size of the mission. That in Cyprus is a fraction of the size of that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I would speculate. I haven't looked at them recently, and that certainly have been in the past. But the reality is the political headquarters is generally smaller than the military headquarters, inevitably, because of the range of staff functions and the military's almost desire to have more and more people in headquarters micromanaging things. And actually, again, go back to it in peacekeeping, where you have these contingents from different countries with all sorts of different challenges, logistics challenges, simple things like one might be halal, one might not be halal in terms of feeding. You do need a reasonably sized headquarters to make these things work. So I think I come back to this business about personalities again, and I think the key skill to being a staff officer, whether civilian or military, in a peacekeeping mission is having an open mind. And that might sound statement of the obvious. Surely all staff officers should have an open mind. Well, that's true up to a point. But if you're in a national brigade headquarters or something around that size, possibly up to division, actually you don't need necessarily lots of open-mindedness. You need people who can work for system, who understand how systems work. In peacekeeping, it's much more complicated. You can't just pitch up and go, oh, I think you'll find our planning methodology is best, and therefore you will just follow. Obviously, a foreign chap, you'll follow exactly what we do. It doesn't matter whether you're British saying that, or Indian saying that, or Bangladeshi saying that, or Nigerian, or American, or whatever. You've got to go in and say, okay, well, how would you approach this problem? There's always a set of problems. Well, we'd look at it this way. Okay, well, that's quite interesting. We would look at it this way. Is there a middle ground where we can help actually end up with a better solution by amalgamating our two approaches or listening to each other's two approaches? And that can be a problem. And the risk of going off at a slight tangent, one of the problems I would argue in the past is, whilst the people I know who have been staff officers in UN headquarters have all, almost to a man and a woman, been absolutely excellent people, the perception back at home has been, it's not quite the same as being in 7 Brigade or the ARC or 1 Div or whatever. It's always been a bit, it's a bit like going to work in NATO, really, isn't it? It's not quite the same. And as a result, people don't throw themselves into these tasks, despite the fact I would contend they're much more challenging. They require a much broader range of skills to be successful in than perhaps it does to go and do, frankly, a conventional job in a conventional headquarters.
It's funny, I remember meeting a guy, Royal Marine, when I was working at the Maritime Warfare Centre. I think it was Dave Tice, and he had done a 18-month stint in New York in the peacekeeping office in the UN. And he would evangelise about his experience. He said he learned more in that period about how to cooperate, collaborate, and plan in reality than he ever did in his 30 years of experience in formal military Western NATO-based headquarters, of which he had a plethora of experience. I mean, this was the moment that he said he actually started to understand military operations outside of this formed hierarchical set-piece battle. He said it was so different. It was extraordinary. And it was a massive learning curve. But fortunately, he was picked and he had the culture. I mean, he didn't come across that way. He was a big, burly guy, very strict, very loud. But he said, the art of doing this, and it is an art, is about personal relationships, it's about approachability, and it is about culture. And he had that within himself to do it. Nothing from the military assisted him in doing that. Nothing from his Royal Marines training assisted him in doing it. Is it really interesting to hear that kind of approach from people, as opposed to others who went off, and as you say, it was a 6-month tour that he had to get out of the way because there was a better job at the end of it. There was a very different approach. And I was just thinking back on, I looked up some figures beforehand. The UK proudly says it contributes 680 people to peacekeeping missions. Actually, as of January this year, the UK was contributing 268. The USA contributed 21 to UN peacekeeping missions. The Swiss, by comparison, contributed 22. Denmark contributes 11 people across UN missions. The Dominican Republic also contributes 11. You can go through others. Italy, largest NATO member, contributing 954 people, less than either Zambia or Cameroon. And all those numbers are dwarfed to the top 4 contributing nations, Nepal, Rwanda, Bangladesh, and India, all of whom have very different cultures in terms of planning, collaboration, cooperation, even whilst we think they might be in a sort of military mindset. They have much more experience in dealing with these fuzzy questions in how they plan, which must make the introduction of a commander and perhaps a set of military planners within that headquarters a really tricky task if you don't pick the right people.
Yeah, and of course, in most cases, stand fast things like the force commander, potentially the deputy, these will be national appointments. So the UN doesn't even get a vote in it. It'll be, the headquarters have been divvied up. So, as I said, the chief of staff of UNMISS and South Sudan, in my time there, rotated between UK and Norway, 1 year each. And that had been agreed as part of the setting up of the mission. And that's fine. But what it means is the organisation that is mandating the mission doesn't actually get a vote in who's going forward. It has a vote in the force commander. The force commander will always be effectively an appointment of a Secretary General, managed probably a tier below that. But the reality is that most of the individuals that will be in these headquarters are sent there because their states want them there for one reason or another. And I'll give you three reasons. One, because the contributing state has a political investment. So the UK and Norway were part of the Troika in South Sudan, which had contributed to the less than successful now peace agreement. Well, successful between South Sudan and Sudan, but not necessarily within South Sudan. So, that's why they were there. So they had a political investment. Or you've got military troops in significant numbers on the ground. So, in that case, Rwanda and India clearly wanted a role in the game. And then the last one, which kind of some ways links to the first, can be if you've got a significant financial investment, i.e. you're one of the big financial contributors to UN peacekeeping rather than big troop contributors. Because, when you were reading out the numbers there, the troop contributors and the financial contributors are not necessarily the same people. And these things, of course, do ebb and flow. I mean, you mentioned Italy. The reason Italy is, I think, the biggest troop contributor in NATO is because of Lebanon. It basically provided the spine of the initial, not the initial peacekeeping mission in Lebanon, because there's been one there for a very long time, but the most recent peacekeeping mission in Lebanon. And you find that these legacies, a large part of the UK's contribution is in Cyprus now, which is basically a company of troops. It certainly has been for a long time. The UK's numbers were swelled in the late sort of 20-teens by significant contribution into South Sudan, as it happens. But that's now been withdrawn and actually replaced by Vietnam in large part in terms of a field hospital and some engineers. So there's another example. So you're running a headquarters, and one of your key capabilities, a roll to hospital forward and engineers in support of that, switches from being the British to the Vietnamese. That's a massive cultural change. It's a massive change in how the organizations work. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute one is better or worse, but I'm saying it's just completely different ways of operating, completely different hierarchical structures. They may look the same on paper. They don't operate the same.
So I guess part of this linkage, they're all complicating factors, is who pays, right? I mean, is that a factor in the subconscious of the way that missions work? Largely because if you're used to operating in a national mindset, national deployments as part of NATO, all these structures are rigidly set. You know who you're going to be answering to, you know how they work, it's all sort of standardised. It might be difficult because of personalities. There's a NATO planning process, a NATO force design process, there's a NATO fighting process. All this is sort of established. And one of the things you never think about in any of these is who's paying. Is that an issue? I mean, where do peacekeeping missions get funded from?
Well, I mean, it varies, but in essence, different nations make different contributions to the UN peacekeeping pot. Some will add more of a particular mission they feel strongly about. So I think, broadly speaking, there's like a block vote and an operational vote, but mostly it's done on a subvention basis. So, and if you look at the main financial contributors, they've been pretty consistent, I think much more so in some ways than the troop contributors over recent years. And the big change was China in the early 2000s, going from quite low down the list to being a major financial contributor. But one of the points I was trying to bring out was this business of how different contingents operate differently, and understanding that and how that. So there's a UN process, a standardization, which is essentially about ticking some boxes, by which I don't mean it's just a box ticking exercise, but there's a set of tests that any potential troop contributor has to go through and reach certain standards in order to be able to deploy. And part of that is checks of equipment. And some of that equipment is brought by the contingent. Some of that equipment is delivered as part of a mission. And what that means in practice is you will sometimes find contingents with very limited organic logistic support, for example. And you'll find others who, because of history, are completely organically capable of self-sustaining. And that then puts different pressures on the system. But then on top of all of that, so you've got the different capability, but then you have the different political rules that are being applied. So different contingents will have these different, I don't like the phrase red lines, but let's call it that. These different red lines, things they will and will not do. Because the mandate is sufficiently broad, you can say, well, I'm very happy to put a battalion into country X, but our capital won't let us patrol at night. Real world example, won't say who, won't say where, but a real world example. Well, that's kind of key function, but actually better to have a battalion than not to have one at all. You'll have another less experienced, but very strangely quite capable troop contributing country whose battalion, with very limited organic logistic support, just went out and did everything. And to the point where they put their own people at significant risk, not just from the bad guys, but from malnutrition, because as far as they were concerned, they were there to do a job and their capital was quite happy for them to crack on and do it. So you've got these differences. So in terms of the C2, again, coming back, for the headquarters, for the operational headquarters, it's got to really understand those. It's got to understand where these, say, red lines, it's not the best phrase, but where these limitations are effectively.
Yeah, permissions and boundaries. I mean, we're sort of familiar with those in coalitions of the willing, right? Is some people will say, yes, you can do it. And interestingly, it is often, for example, in 2003 in Iraq, the first people across the line were not the US Air Force or missiles or anything else. It was small, discrete sections of Baltic state special forces, former Eastern Bloc special forces, who had the political permissions to go in and undertake these actions. This is a similar thing, right? And the commander must be clearly willing to exploit those, not just understand them, but to then exploit them. And the commander's mindset and his philosophy also needs to be pretty clear about that too, right?
Yeah, and don't forget, you then have the added complication that the commander will almost definitely be from the nation of one of the troop contributing countries. So how awkward is it when your battalion, let's call it a battalion, your brigade, whatever it is not the most capable. And you're having to say, well, actually, I'm not going to use my troops for that mission. I'm going to have to use troops from another country. And that's quite, back in capital, they may be saying, General, why are you allowing this other country to get all the credit when we've sent a battalion there? Well, you've sent them there with so many constraints that they can't actually do the thing I need them to do. So it is potentially quite complicated. Again, I would reiterate that I think things like South Sudan, like DRC, these are examples of the most challenging environments for peacekeeping operations. And an ISAF setup, which was not without its problems, an ISAF setup will not have the same degree of issues. And logically speaking, a European-led and delivered reassurance force in Ukraine should be able to pull together headquarters where there is enough commonality to minimize some of these issues. But that doesn't mean you should be blind to the risks. And actually, I would say, if I was going to be in that headquarters, I would not necessarily be looking at HQ ISAF. I would look at that, but I'd go and look at these more challenging environments. Say, well, what did happen in DRC? What were the challenges there? How did the commanders deal with it at the various points of how the operation has grown and changed and developed and moved?
I was struck then by you saying, looking at different missions and different tasks, that there's sort of four broad categories of peacekeeping missions: conflict prevention and mediation, peacemaking, peace enforcement, and peace building. They're all very different types of mandate that you potentially come up with. They're different types of military missions, specified and implied tasks that fall out of them. How different do they look and feel in terms of C2? Can you just say there's one sort of peacekeeping headquarters setup that looks like this, or are they all task context specific?
I would argue that in practical terms, I know this categorization works well for a lot of analysis. I'm not sure it actually necessarily reflects the reality on the ground. And when I think of those big UN missions, they're doing all four of those probably at the same time. And again, this is part of the challenge. And I look at a potential mission in Ukraine and envisage it will be doing, hopefully not peace enforcement, but certainly peacekeeping, by which we, I think we're thinking about ensuring there are no incursions. It will certainly be doing peace building in terms of rebuilding societies and communities in Ukraine itself. And then conflict prevention, that's why it's there. So you've got all of those tasks going on at the same time. And I don't think there's a model headquarters for each of those four things. What you've got to do, though, is when you think about your headquarters, is think about all of those tasks and how you're going to make them work together, potentially in different parts of the country, perhaps geographically separated in some cases overlapping, and how you're going to have, at the same time, people who are prepared to go and fight bad guys at the same time as rebuild security forces, not necessarily the Ukrainian armed forces, although that's clearly going to be part of any mission, I would suggest. But, things like the police. I'm not an expert on it, but, the policing of Ukraine will have been badly damaged by the conflict in the sense that a number of the people who should be doing policing will now be on the front line. So, it would be my best guess that there is a significant gap in the policing capability in Ukraine now. And that all has to be rebuilt. And this was, I think, one of the challenges ISAF faced. At various points, I think it flip-flopped between what the priority was. Was the priority going out and defeating the Taliban, or was the priority peace building? And of course, counterinsurgency strategy, as adopted then, kind of suggests you need to be trying to do both at the same time. And that does come with a set of challenges. And I think generally our headquarters is pretty good at doing one or the other, but find it quite difficult to integrate the two, or three, as we just talked.
Yeah, I mean, they're not easy tasks, and they'd often naturally, in sort of, military planning terms, be pretty much mutually exclusive. You want to do one in sort of linear way and then go on and do another. But because the overlaps, the missions conflict sometimes, how you try and break that apart to make them mutually reinforcing as opposed to combative is a really challenging intellectual task, but it's also difficult on the ground, right? I mean, the company that's on patrol finds itself in one village in one situation, another village in a completely different situation. The mindset that goes right down the sort of command and control route is really important. So I guess the sort of commander's philosophy, the philosophy of the mission, does that in peacekeeping missions tend to come from the commander, from the headquarters, or is it left to troop contributing nations? I mean, if you've got a country X will interpret, a mission in a slightly different way than country Y, and their troops will feel the same way about it. How much of that is pulled together by a clear commander's intent, or is it much more woolly than that?
I'm afraid I'm going to give you the classic academic answer. It varies. And I think that's very much about the practicalities, Peter. I mean, forgive me if I keep banging on about South Sudan, but it's one of the case studies I know best. But even one of the world's best commanders would have found that a difficult challenge, because it's fine going, here's my intent. That will be cast down to the people. But actually, comms are really challenging. And when I say comms, I don't just mean radios and internet and that sort of comms. Getting to see people, tiny force of helicopters, massive demands on them. So actually being able to go face to face with your subordinates is a challenge. So really getting your command intent across. And the contrast in the UN terms, again, because I think it's a useful contrast in a way, is somewhere like Cyprus, where the commander can get out and see pretty much everyone all in a day. If you want to spend some time with them, you'd take a bit longer. But you could absolutely go and see all the major troop contributors in a day. And it would take you more than a day, potentially, to just go and see one contingent in a place like South Sudan. So that becomes part of the problem. So the idea of the all-seeing, all-knowing commander, I think, is potentially quite difficult in some of these operations. Plus, let's be brutal, not all contingents will report back everything that's going on, particularly if it doesn't reflect well on their, in a way that wouldn't necessarily, I mean, these things happen in national setups as well, but they're much easier to manage in a national setup and much more difficult in these ad hoc international coalitions, which is effectively what UN peacekeeping are. And the other thing I was just going to mention, because we talked at the outset about the pole mill challenge at the strategic to the operational level, there's also a pole mill challenge at the tactical level, because going back to your point about conducting all of these tasks at the same time, effectively from peace building through to conflict prevention, a significant proportion of those tasks will be conducted by civilians. And for a significant proportion of the time, the military will be in support. And then the critical thing then is understanding your civilian counterparts. And you and I both know the amount of effort that went in Afghanistan, particularly after Iraq, into trying to make that better. And there's no doubt there were massive improvements. From, say, 2001 through to 2014, there were massive improvements in the quality of those relationships because of better mutual understanding. But 2014 was 10 years ago. What have we been doing since to maintain that? I think there's a whole new set of challenges will come. Understanding how you work with NGOs, understanding how you work with development actors, understanding how you work with people who work in education, who your job might be to simply protect them, understanding their priorities. I think we've potentially lost some of the skills we had hard earned, potentially. I mean, all sorts of organizations were set up at the time, which were supposed to make this core business. I sense, since I've left the military, that a number of those have atrophied. I'm not in it on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure there will be people who will argue that, but I do sense they have atrophied because that's not been the priority.
So a final one, which I'm afraid takes us right down into the weeds, and it just struck me as quite interesting. If NATO is not allowed to contribute, be a front runner, use its equipment or anything else, the structures might well be. The IT systems that C2 relies on, most NATO states will be used to using a NATO system or a NATO compatible system, national one maybe. And when they deploy for things like ISAF tasks they've been used to doing, then the framework nation has provided. So you've had something like Centrix ISAF, Centrix 4I, Centrix GCTF. The US has provided the framework IT system that enables command and control in a way that sort of works. What about the rest of UN peacekeeping missions? Are they able to operate? Are there secure comms that the UN provides? Is there an IT system, or is it framework nation, buy off the shelf, wire something together and see what the J6 can make happen?
It's closer to the latter than the former. And it will be, in some cases, and I did some work some years ago looking at establishing the African Union mission in Darfur, the second African Union mission in Darfur, Amos 2. And this was one of the conversations that we were having as a group of partner nations to the African Union. So the Brits, the Canadians, the Americans, the Dutch and others. Sitting around the room, and it literally at the level of, well, who's going to provide the vehicles? So country A says, we'll buy 100 Land Cruisers or whatever. Country B will provide the radios to link the vehicles and the ground stations and everything else. Where are you buying the Land Cruisers from? How do we get together to put those things physically together? I mean, that's probably an extreme example, but this was not quite in the era before broadband and the expectations that come with decent bandwidth. But that was a very practical challenge. In this particular case, I mean, looking at perhaps the context of Ukraine, a reassurance mission in Ukraine, you would have to have a group of like-mindeds who are going to be the core of this, potentially France, Germany, UK, whatever, maybe Canada, come together and buy a bespoke network. They're literally going to, I think, because the idea that you could, there's every chance under the current administration, the US could block the deployment of NATO equipment, even if it's equipment that is kind of dual national and NATO rolled. It seems very clear to me that the Russians are not going to allow anything inside Ukraine that has a clear NATO badge on it. And politically, you can kind of get it. That's their narrative. We don't want Ukraine to become a member of NATO. Well, it's not become a member of NATO, but guess what? There's a massive NATO force now inside it. I kind of get where they're coming from. But if that is the case, how do we provide the infrastructure? And it will require those key nations, I think, to come together. And you and I both know that that will be a massive challenge because each of them will want one of their businesses to get the money for doing this. So there'll be a temptation to go for a sort of hybrid coalition business model response thing. So British business A will provide this, French business B will provide, and so on. And that will just lead to, it will take months and months to get the thing set up and working. Whereas if you went for a single source contractor, having clearly competed it appropriately, you have the potential to get it done much more quickly. But you're also going to have to accept risk in terms of classification. And I think this will be problematic for all of the NATO nations who are used to having their own national systems as well as NATO systems. Is the idea, you're not going to be able to parallel that, I don't think, not in any quick and easy way.
Yeah, we've run out of time. Thanks so much for sparing the time to talk to us. I always learn something new when I chat to you, and this was no different from the usual. Appreciate you lending us your expertise. The show is sponsored by Systematic.
Citaware is trusted by more than 50 nations worldwide, including 17 NATO nations,
We hope you enjoyed the show. As well as telling your friends and colleagues about it, please do subscribe, leave us a review on any of your usual podcast streaming platforms. This really helps us to reach new audiences and spread the word. The show is produced by AureliusThinking.com as a show for the Waiver Room, the home of intellectual curiosity and challenging thinking for military professionals everywhere. Thanks for listening.